The soft light of an autumn morning poured through the window of the ward like a misty haze, enveloping everything around with warmth and peace. It seemed like an ordinary morning in the hospital, but a sudden cold breeze that blew in with it made me shiver. I felt him even before I saw him. James was standing in the doorway with an icy smile on his lips. His gaze was hard and penetrating, like an X-ray, from which there is no hiding. His words sounded like a sentence. "You can't even do household chores, so we could get a divorce, and you'd better give me your assets too," he said, barely hiding a sarcastic grin, as if already anticipating his triumph. My heart started pounding faster, but I pulled myself together. So many years of care and devotion, filled with our quiet weekdays and cozy evenings, faded from his laziness and inattention, suddenly crumbled into ashes. There was an impenetrable confidence, even arrogance, in James's eyes. He seems to have completely forgotten that I'm not the naive housewife I've been all these years. That, despite the routine of my life, I had an inheritance of my own, an inheritance that he didn't even know about. A strange woman was standing next to James, his hand was on her waist, and her eyes slid over me with a contemptuous spark, not lingering for a moment, as if I were an empty place. This woman, hardly graceful but confident, was a symbol of his new life. I recognized her immediately, Patricia Heaton, a name that, like drops of poison, penetrated into our conversations, into his views, even when I thought that these were just work meetings, business dinners. Now I could see everything as it is. It was the end of our life together. "Take care of yourself, Mrs." Patricia said with a grin, emphasizing the word as if it no longer meant anything. "You're not Mrs. anymore," James said, releasing her and nodding in my direction. "Take care of yourself, ma'am." They laughed, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That laugh, like a cold wind, left a void in its wake, but, for some reason, my heart felt lighter. My affection for James eventually became covered in a layer of dust, like an old family photo on a forgotten shelf. "I used to be there for you, to take care of you, to devote myself to this marriage, not noticing how the years went by, taking with them the joy of our first meetings." Now, looking at him with such contempt and realizing that his betrayal had finally stopped being hidden, I felt strangely relieved. Today is Friday, and the divorce, if everything goes according to plan, will be finalized on Monday. Mentally imagining the 3 days of waiting, I suddenly realized that they did not stretch like a gloomy shadow. On the contrary, a new, long, forgotten feeling of freedom overwhelmed me. I just had to wait. At first, James was the epitome of a caring and attentive husband, the one I dreamed of in my youth, imagining a future life. His soft voice sounded like a song when he uttered words of support, promised me comfort, and that happy, cloudless life that each of us once imagined in our dreams. But, as often happens, these early years, like spring days, withered over time, and were replaced by a cold autumn wind of change. About 5 years later, I began to notice how James was changing. His words, which had been so warm before, took on a sharpness like the thorns on an old rose. He began to remind me whose money I was living on, not rudely, but as if it was supposed to hurt me, as if every such injection had been thought out in advance, as if he wanted to hammer into me the idea that I was nothing without him. He did not tolerate excuses, even glances at his remarks began to cause irritation. I realized that whenever I tried to answer, argue, or at least explain something, he brushed me off like an annoying fly, repeating that I was not capable of anything, could only stay at home. Those words were like a lash to me. I used to be full of life and self-confidence, but next to James they melted away like smoke in the wind. I resigned myself to the role of a submissive wife, abandoned my dreams, habits, desires, giving myself up to everyday life and caring for James, believing that this was my duty. After graduating from university, James quickly found a prestigious job, joining a well-known company, where his career seemed to promise a takeoff and a secure future for both of us. But after about 6 years, to my surprise, he left. The reason for leaving has remained unclear to me. As he explained to me, he was not appreciated there, but soon after that he found a new job again, from where he left almost as suddenly. Now our financial situation was precarious, and I couldn't help but feel like I was on thin ice. We had to constantly squeeze, save money, and barely make ends meet. Yes, we still had some savings, but they were melting away every day. It took several more years before James got a job in a new place, where it seemed that he finally managed to find a common language with colleagues and, perhaps, even feel needed. I quietly hoped that now we could live in peace, without fear for tomorrow, but this hope turned out to be fleeting. One evening, while I was cooking dinner, James came home earlier than usual. There was no usual sparkle in his eyes, and his footsteps sounded as if he was dragging a heavy burden behind him. "I quit my job," he said shortly, without even greeting me. I froze, stunned, not knowing how to react. The words came out of my mouth before I could stop myself. "But why?" James turned abruptly, his brows furrowed threateningly, and his gaze turned icy. "You can't even ask how I'm doing, and immediately start criticizing what I'm doing. You're getting bolder every day," he blurted out with disdain, which made me feel like something was squeezing inside me. The words stuck in my throat. I lowered my eyes and mumbled only an apology so as not to aggravate the situation. He sat down on the sofa and turned on the TV, expecting me to serve him in silence, as always. Trying to suppress my own feelings, I brought him a glass of beer, as he liked, and asked quietly, "Do you want dinner or a bath?" "Food and alcohol," he threw, without deigning to look at me. As usual, I complied with his request, hiding my disappointment behind a mask of indifference. After dinner, James collapsed on the couch and soon began to snore, leaving behind a table littered with crumbs, leftovers, and empty bottles, like some big, clumsy child. Thoughts of divorce began to reach out to my mind, like a dim but inextinguishable light in the depths of a tunnel. They seemed to be born out of fatigue itself, out of an unspeakable sense of self-loss. The day I finally decided to take action, my hands barely obeyed me. I went to the city office, my first step to freedom, to a life that had not been in this house for a long time. The signed divorce papers, neatly folded, now lay at the bottom of my bag, as a last reminder of hope buried deep in the past. These documents became a kind of amulet, a shield that protected me from what might one day become unbearable. With them, I found a strange sense of calm. It was as if I knew that if the moment came when patience would disappear, I would be able to break all the threads that bound us. However, they had to be hidden with great care. If James had stumbled upon them, his suspicions could have escalated into something unpredictable. The next day, as soon as I entered the house, James was already waiting for me at the door. A spark of suspicion flashed in his eyes as he asked slowly, "Hey, where did you go while I was working?" I hurried to pick up the first explanation that came to mind. I was at the stationery store. I bought some resumes. "You know, maybe you'll need them," I said, trying to be confident, but I felt my stomach clench with nervousness. James, frowning at me at first, accepted the resume, almost rereading it syllabically. His face gradually smoothed out, his suspicions dissolved like shadows in the morning sun. Soon he announced that he was going to have a drink with a friend, and left, leaving me in silence. I let out a sigh of relief. Time passed, and James got a job in a reputable company. This place was not just a new job, but perhaps his last chance at success. It seemed that luck began to smile on him again. He was promoted after 2 years, and he celebrated it with such passion, as if he had defeated all his invisible enemies. I was struck by his joy, the brightness with which he began this new chapter, as if all the bad things were behind him. I even quietly hoped that maybe this time he would be able to hold on to this place until retirement, that his life would become more stable. Every day, when James returned home after work, he was cheerful and full of energy. The department in which he worked was engaged in sales, which means that eternal negotiations and evening events became a familiar part of his schedule. He often left for evening meetings, and I was left alone in the house, surrounded by silence, which seemed to me a real breath of fresh air. At such moments, I enjoyed a brief, fleeting freedom, gathering the strength to greet him with a smile upon his return. One such evening, when James was at another meeting, the phone rang. My mom was on the other end of the line. Her voice sounded excited and happy, as it had not sounded for a long time. "Darling, you won't believe it." She could barely utter with joy. "We sold those lands, remember? For $10 million. Can you imagine?" I froze, stunned by her words. 10 million? I asked, feeling surprise sweep over me from head to toe. "Yes," Mom confirmed, not hiding her delight. "Mountains and lands that we owned. We don't use them anymore, and now they've been evaluated. Altogether, it's worth 15 million, but we only need 3 to provide for the rest of our lives. The rest is yours if you decide to change something in your life, honey." My mother's words seemed to fall to the bottom of my heart like a stone, causing waves of a previously unknown feeling of power. When the phone went silent, my mother's words continued to echo in my mind, filling it with a vague sense of freedom that I couldn't immediately comprehend. Grandmother prudently rewrote the title to my name, saving me from unnecessary inheritance taxes and leaving this legacy only to me as a personal protective bastion. But I knew perfectly well that telling James about it would be tantamount to a shot at my own plans. His reaction to the news would surely have been predictable, too greedy, too demanding, as always. It's only been a week, and fate, as if testing my patience and determination, presented me with a test. I was in an accident. Despite the serious bruises, my life was not in danger, but the doctors insisted that I remain under observation for a week. While I was lying in the hospital room, the quiet hum of equipment and the pungent smell of antiseptics became my unwitting companions. One of the first days, I collected all my valuables, including documents, and hid them in a drawer, feeling how the proximity of the signed divorce papers gives me a fragile, but so necessary sense of calm. I decided to call James right away to report the incident. My voice was shaking with pain and weakness, but after gathering my strength, I calmly explained the situation to him, expecting that perhaps he would show at least a little sympathy. But his first question made me laugh coldly, bitterly. "What about my dinner?" "What is it?" he asked with irritation, as if the injury I received was nothing more than a minor inconvenience for him. Barely able to contain my bewilderment, I explained that I would be here for about a week, and asked him to think about buying food on his own until I could return home. "Spring food," he muttered contemptuously. "How can you be such a lazy wife? But okay, I'll come and deal with you." He hung up on me, leaving me lost in thought. For a moment, I wondered if I should tell him about the inheritance. Perhaps this news would at least smooth out his mood. But looking at the cold metal tubes surrounding me, I realized that telling him about it would be like giving a predator his prey. After a while, James entered the room with an expression of undisguised contempt on his face. He barely glanced at me, connected to the machines, and grinned, as if the very fact of my helplessness gave him pleasure. "You're useless, you can't even do housework," he muttered mockingly, his voice sounding like it was forged from ice. "So maybe we should get a divorce? And you'll probably pay me compensation for the lost years," he added with a wry grin that sent a chill down my spine. I sighed, feeling my fear give way to cold determination. These words are the point beyond which there will be no turning back. Without turning away from his gaze, I pulled out the divorce papers from my bag, stored for so long as an amulet against despair. His face contorted with triumph as he took them, confident of his victory. There was a young woman standing next to him, whom I hadn't noticed before. Patricia, as it turned out. James grabbed her by the waist, and she, not hiding her contempt, showered me with sharp words, as if someone burdened with a dark past. "Well, take care of yourself, old lady," she added with a venomous smile before they both left, leaving an echo of their laughter behind them. I was left alone in the room, surrounded by silence. In the silence of the hospital room, after they left, I laughed a laugh full of relief bordering on madness. Oh, how symbolic. Today is Friday, and my divorce papers won't be processed until Monday. These 3 days stretched out in front of me like the expectation of freedom, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that I was not holding any burden behind me. My life finally belonged to me. The weekend was surprisingly calm. James didn't call or text, he was probably too busy celebrating with his new wife. It even seemed to me that the air had become lighter, that the hospital walls were not pressing on me as much as before. I was not used to inactivity, because I was always busy with household chores, taking care of my husband, but this peace became surprisingly sweet for me. The nurses encouraged me, advised me to stay calm and rest. And yet Monday approached with anxious anticipation. I knew that my decision would take effect. That evening, James started calling me endlessly. The phone seemed to be bursting with his insistence. At first, I just ignored the calls, enjoying my small but important victory over him, but after 15 minutes of constant ringing, I gave up and answered, ready for what was coming. "Could you not be so persistent?" I said calmly, barely able to keep from laughing. "Hey, what does this mean?" He exploded from the other end of the line, his voice full of rage. I couldn't help but burst out laughing, listening to his anger. For a man who had been so insistent a few days ago that he wanted a divorce, his reaction was incredibly funny. "What are you talking about?" I added, still laughing. James seemed to be on edge. "Don't pretend. Divorce papers, they are not accepted." He blurted out, and I imagined his face blushing as he unsuccessfully tried to figure out what had gone wrong. I smiled and replied calmly, "Oh, I've already filed a notice of acceptance. Do you remember how you said, 'Let's get divorced,' every time we fought? I just decided to help you with this desire and save you from the temptation to do it in the heat of another quarrel. That would be unwise, wouldn't it? Call him off immediately." James shouted, his demand full of desperation. "I can't do this until I'm discharged. I need to go through the procedures at the municipal office," I replied with apparent calmness, barely suppressing a smile. "Then check out right now. Don't be so stubborn." His selfish demands made me laugh again. Now, more than ever, I understood that his haste was related to the desire to register a new marriage with Patricia as soon as possible. I remembered how she called herself his wife on Friday, and decided to add a little fuel to the fire. "By the way, Patricia. She's your lover, isn't she?" "This is rude to Patricia." "I'm sorry, but she's my new wife," he said, not realizing that he was on the verge of his stupidity. "Oh, so you admit that technically she's yours, but for now, she's just your lover," I added with composure, barely holding back another fit of laughter. There was a strange sound in the receiver, something between a groan and a scream, as if my words had finally cut through his bravado. Deciding that the moment was right, I struck the last blow. "By the way, be ready to hear from my lawyer. The division of property, this is a serious matter, So you better get ready for a fair division right away, James. The next morning, the phone started ringing in the morning, not giving me a moment's peace. Ring after ring, as if his persistence could take me back to the past, where I had to obey his demands without question. Sitting in the hospital room, I finally pressed the call button, waiting for a new stream of senseless accusations and outrage from James. As expected, his voice came from the other end, but this time there was more urgency, almost desperation in it. "Nicole," he began with deliberate efficiency, trying, it seemed, to make his words convincing. "You must understand that you are also responsible for our marriage. You didn't take care of me, you left me alone when you should have supported your husband. Isn't that what a good wife does?" His words, devoid of any logic, sounded like a pathetic excuse, ironic in its absurdity. I listened to him, becoming more and more convinced that he really believed in what he was saying, believed that carefree behavior towards his wife in the hospital could be called her fault. I let him speak, patiently waiting for him to shut up. "James," I said with icy calm, "what kind of guilt are you insisting on? Do you really think that my inability to take care of you from a hospital bed makes me guilty? I'm here now because I had an accident, and you know it perfectly well. And if you were a child in need of constant care, then maybe that would be an understandable excuse. But you're a grown man who can take care of himself. Isn't that right?" I could feel the confused silence on the other side, but James quickly gathered himself, and his voice regained its former confidence. "I think it's your fault that you stopped taking care of our house. And I'm sure the judge will notice it too," he replied, his voice sounding self-confident. I couldn't help but smile, startled by his ridiculous arguments. How naive, how ridiculous one has to be to believe that the judge will really support his theory about guilt. Realizing that his logic was as childish as his ideas about marriage, I only gently remarked, "You understand, James, that there is a legitimate definition of guilt, and it includes things like infidelity. For example, if you have another woman, despite having a wife, it is treason. Patricia is my new wife, and you. I don't need you anymore," he blurted out in response, still not noticing the contradictions in his words. "So here's the thing, James," I said calmly, "if you start a new relationship while you're formally married, it's cheating. You've been seeing her behind my back, and that's undeniable. So, according to the law, it's your fault." There was fury in his voice, as if I'd dealt him a blow he hadn't expected. And then, finally tired of his ridiculous accusations and attempts to shift responsibility, I coldly added, "Please, from now on, discuss all our issues through my lawyer. Have a nice day, James." "Nicole, wait!" he shouted, but I had already pressed the end call button, ending this meaningless conversation. The phone rang several more times from his calls, but I ignored them, not allowing him to break into my space again. Finally, the ringing stopped, and I managed to breathe freely. My life was finally under my control, and the thought that it was no longer necessary to obey his whims brought me incredible relief. But the next morning, my peace was disturbed by a new call. This time from a different number, but with the same persistence. When the phone rang again, I already knew that James would be on the other end. There seemed to be no limit to his indignation. He began to complain with a ferocity and a demanding manner that he believed should have forced me to comply, as if I were a mechanism that he could force to act at will. However, his words seemed meaningless to me at first, until he mentioned that he was unable to withdraw money from the account. My mind immediately tensed up. If it was our joint account, then there should have been no problems with withdrawal. But if it's about my personal savings... You're not trying to withdraw money from my account, are you? I asked calmly, trying not to betray the indignation in my voice. You're in the hospital anyway. he said in response, as if that explained something. I was thinking of taking some money, but the card doesn't work. Having gathered all the self-control not to break out into a scream, I realized that I had done the right thing when I contacted the bank in advance. I asked them to block the possibility of withdrawing funds until I get out of the hospital. Without even imagining the extent to which James had reached in his despair, I had taken measures in advance to protect my savings. After all, it was truly terrible to imagine that someone who once promised to be there for me, in trouble and in joy, would now pull the last money out of me. His behavior was strikingly different from the commitments and promises we made to each other. But, as it turned out, for James there were no boundaries, no understanding of the offensiveness of his actions. Unlock your account immediately and give up these stupid restrictions, he demanded, trying to remind me of his power again. What are you talking about, James? We're practically strangers now. Why should I do what you say? I replied calmly, withstanding his pressure. Strangers? He snorted in disbelief. You are my wife, and the divorce has not yet been officially finalized. So behave like a wife and do what I say. We have nothing to share, James, I replied with equanimity, knowing full well that my words would hurt him. I don't have the money to give to strangers. I heard him stop talking, clearly shocked by my words. He didn't expect such firmness from me. In his world, I should have given in long ago, apologized, and maybe even done everything as he demanded. But now his assertiveness, his attempts to manipulate me no longer had any power over me. Just do as I say, he continued, desperately clutching at the remnants of his power. I demand compensation for all those years that you didn't work, didn't take proper care of the house. His demands seemed to me ridiculous to the core. I remembered how, when I was younger, I saw potential in him, a desire to learn, an interest in success. However, years in a frivolous attitude to our finances have shown that he really lacked common sense and responsibility. I worked alongside him for 18 years, putting not only my efforts into our home and our marriage, but also my dreams, hopes, and my dedication. But now, listening to his senseless accusations, demands, and his surprise, I clearly realized this man was a mistake. My choice then may have been based on an illusion that has crumbled to dust today. James, clinging desperately to my money and the remnants of his former control, reminded me more of a child than a man. I could only guess how much he had exhausted his reserves trying to stay afloat, and was probably counting on my money as a way to cover his expenses. His demands, his attempts to squeeze the last out of me clearly showed that he had absolutely no idea how to behave on his own. Listening to James's halting speech, I started talking to him as if he were an unreasonable child who needed to explain the obvious things. Look, James, I'm not your submissive wife anymore. We will settle the division of property through a lawyer, and I will not talk to you about this topic anymore. How dare you? He shouted back. I'll come right now and we'll talk about it face to face. But I had already anticipated his attempts to invade my space. After asking the nurses at the post not to let anyone in except my parents, I was relieved to realize that even if he did show up, he would not be able to get into the room. As I expected, James actually came to the hospital. I was informed that he was trying to get through, but the nurse at the post resolutely blocked his way, explaining that access to my room was limited. Soon, the phone rang again. I didn't answer, and then James switched to messages. The screen was filled with notifications, one after another, but I just saved them as evidence, waiting for him to get bored. After a while, I still had to call a lawyer to clarify the situation. It seems that after the lawyer contacted James, the flow of messages stopped. I naively thought that this was the end, but soon the nurse quietly entered the room and said, "You have a visitor named Julia. Would you like to meet her?" Julia?" I asked, raising my eyebrows in surprise, but immediately asked her to let me in. Julia was a friend whose sincerity always warmed my soul. We became close many years ago, when I posted several posts on social networks, sharing my impressions of one of the evenings I spent in a small cozy restaurant. Julia responded to my notes, and it turned out that we lived nearby. We started going out to lunch together, sharing stories and impressions with each other, getting closer and closer. After marriage, our meetings became less frequent, but we kept in touch, arranging tea gatherings and exchanging news. She entered the room with a smile and warmth in her eyes, and there was genuine concern in her gaze. "Nicole, how are you? Is everything okay after the accident?" "What is it?" she asked, as soon as she was next to me. "Yes, I feel much better now, thank you, Julia," I replied, feeling her concern warming me like a light, warm blanket. Suddenly, I realized that since my hospitalization, no one except my parents and staff had shown such concern about me. Julia looked at me sadly and said softly, "Hey, Nicole, it's hard for you right now, isn't it?" I flinched slightly when she said that. I didn't share my situation with anyone other than my parents or mention my problems with James. It seemed like she knew a lot more than I could have guessed. "How do you know?" I asked, looking at her with surprise and bewilderment. Julia hesitated for a moment, and then said something that sounded like a bolt from the blue to me. "Do you know Patricia, that young woman?" "Yes, that's her. She's having an affair with your husband." My mind immediately recoiled, stunned by her words. How could she know about this? Julia nervously fingered the hem of her coat, her voice trembling as she finally confessed. "Actually, Patricia is my niece, Nicole." I understand how it sounds. I was shocked when I found out about it. Hearing these words, I froze, trying to comprehend the connection between Julia and the woman who ruined my marriage. I would never have thought that someone so close to me was the aunt of my most hated rival. There was silence in the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Julia didn't seem to know how to continue, but she took a deep breath and gathered her thoughts. "It all started when Patricia suddenly announced to my sister that she was getting married," she said, lowering her voice. My sister, her mother, was delighted until she heard that her chosen one was 47 years old. "When I saw the photo, it was your husband, Nicole. I told my sister that I was very sorry that she had fallen in love with him." Her face was full of guilt, and she added, "I understand that this will not atone for her actions, but, Nicole, know that my sister and I condemn her behavior. We will keep an eye on her and demand that she compensate for the damage. You've been my friend for 22 years now, and I don't want to lose you over this." I hugged her, feeling grateful for her support. "Julia, it's not your fault. Don't apologize. I don't want to lose you either." Julia's words of support have become a real support for me. We agreed to meet with James and Patricia the next day. Julia offered to be there and even bring photos as proof of their relationship so that James would not be able to deny the obvious. The next day, I left the hospital and prepared for the meeting, filled with determination. We chose a private restaurant to avoid prying eyes and create an atmosphere for a serious conversation. Accompanied by my lawyer, I entered the courtroom and immediately saw James and Patricia. They were sitting at the table, enthusiastically enjoying expensive traditional food. I was struck by their audacity, not a shadow of embarrassment, not a hint of respect for the situation. James barely glanced at me and said with a smug grin, "Finally. Did you bring the money? Don't forget that you're the one paying for this dinner." Patricia, sitting next to me, continued to eat with such an expression on her face, as if she was the mistress of the situation. She looked at me like a creature she shouldn't even notice. I gathered my thoughts and, not giving in to their ridicule, said, "Take care of the payment yourself, Patricia. I didn't come here to please you, but to claim my fair share, the assets that I'm entitled to." James, without looking up from his plate, threw a rude phrase. "God, Nicole, you've always been so unattractive that even your words sound like wounded complaints." The lawyer and I calmly took our places at the table opposite James and Patricia, with the evidence folders spread out in front of us. James, still pompous and self-confident, was absolutely sure of his impunity until we began slowly, point by point, to uncover evidence confirming his guilt and involvement in infidelity. First of all, the lawyer unfolded legal documents detailing the reasons and justification for James' liability. These papers indicated his status as the guilty party, which meant that a significant part of the assets should be distributed in my favor. Patricia continued to chew, casting brief glances at the documents, without losing her ostentatious calm. But when the lawyer spread out the photos provided by Julia, in which Patricia and James are depicted together, her pose suddenly lost its self-confidence. One of the photos particularly excited James. It showed Patricia entering the hotel, accompanied by another man. James's face twisted in confusion. "Patricia, what does it mean?" he blurted out, unable to hide his shock. It was at this moment that Julia entered the room. She looked at Patricia and James with a cold, calm gaze, and there was not a shadow of the old friendliness in her eyes. She remained a friend, faithful and honest, only for me. Restrained but firm, Julia began the story by turning to me. "Nicole, we have been friends for 22 years, and I am ashamed of my niece's behavior, for her actions against you. Patricia, you mentioned that you're carrying James's baby. But considering how you're behaving, who can guarantee that this is really his child?" I held my breath, because this was the first time I had heard about Patricia's pregnancy, but James seemed to believe her words, and his face froze as if he had just been doused with ice water. It seemed that he was only now beginning to realize the depth of betrayal on the part of his young sweetheart. Julia continued, not taking her eyes off her. "If you are really pregnant, we will require a DNA test. And if this is a lie, I will demand additional punishment for deception, for the purpose of extortion." Suddenly, Patricia bowed, her complacency collapsed, and she confessed in a slurred voice. "I'm sorry, James. I lied about the pregnancy. I needed you to leave Nicole. Please forgive me." She tried to keep the remnants of dignity, but her words sounded like a confession in full expectation of money. Raising her head, she began to talk about how she met rich, well-off men, seeing in them the means to realize her dreams. James was her target. She imagined that she could live at his expense, surrounded by luxury, fulfilling her whims and leading an idle lifestyle. "I believed that I could be a housewife, live in comfort and indulge in affairs from time to time," she muttered, blushing under Julia's gaze. Upon hearing this, James stood up, shocked by her words, and, lost, muttered, "I'm truly sorry, but I don't have anything for you." If I had known that. Julia, remaining unperturbed, with a stern expression on her face, said, "Patricia, from now on you are obliged to return to me everything that you spent on your arrangement. Go to work, earn extra money, do whatever you want, but every month you will pay me back. And not a single day is free until you pay the full amount." "Oh no, Aunt, please." Patricia looked at Julia as if she couldn't believe her ears, but there was no hope of forgiveness in her eyes. Julia nodded stiffly, confirming her intention. We exchanged knowing glances, and I felt that in Julia I had found an even more loyal friend and ally than before. The restaurant where this scene took place was gradually filled with people, but we, as if lost in the maelstrom of events, did not notice anyone around. James, confused and pale, finally realizing everything that had happened, got up and came over to me, trying to regain his former confidence. But his voice sounded pleading, flattering, and his gaze was full of despair mixed with horror. "Nicole, I was deceived. Patricia, I can't live without you, let's start all over again. You've always been a housewife, haven't you? It's going to be hard for you without me," he whispered, looking pleadingly into my eyes. I held his gaze, listening coldly as he muttered words about starting a new life, but none of them affected me. When he finished his meaningless speech, I smiled and, without holding back my triumph, replied, "James, I can live very well without you. I'm going to file for divorce soon. And by the way, I never mentioned it, but my personal assets currently amount to about $10 million. So you don't have to worry, it's enough for me not to work for the rest of my life." The surprise on James's face turned to shock. He didn't seem to believe what he was hearing. 10 million? Why didn't you tell me about this? He blurted out, trying to find an explanation, because we could use them together. This money is my personal inheritance. They are not family property and have nothing to do with you, James. I was going to tell you, but only when you started talking about the divorce. They belong only to me, I replied, feeling confidence blossom in the depths of my soul. The lawyer, realizing that the crucial moment had come, silently handed James the documents and a pen. Confused, he signed the papers with trembling hands, peering at them as if trying to find salvation among the lines. We left the restaurant, and by the evening the divorce was officially finalized, ending our 22-year marriage. Soon after, Patricia, with Julia's assistance, transferred a small amount of money to my account. It could hardly compensate for the moral and financial losses, but the symbolic gesture made me feel justice. Julia said that her sister, Patricia's mother, was furious when she learned about the incident. She forced her daughter to take a sabbatical, and then got her a job at a relative's hotel, where Patricia had to work off her debt to me in order to finally realize the consequences of her actions. As for James, his relatives, disappointed in him and in his actions, completely disowned him, refusing to provide him with any help. In desperation, he was forced to accept a loan to pay off the money owed to me. In addition, it turned out that one of the meetings with Patricia at the hotel took place during his working hours, and for this violation he was fired. Having lost a stable income, he was now interrupted by casual construction jobs to pay off debts and survive. When the compensation from James came to my account, I suddenly realized that, despite all this large sum, I had no idea what to spend it on. Deciding that the best investment was to help those in need, I donated half of the amount to charity. I invested the remaining money in a quiet and comfortable life away from noise and worries. I moved to a small village surrounded by nature, where every day began with a quiet dawn and the sounds of the forest. In this place, I found the peace that I had been deprived of for so long. My life has finally found meaning, filled with the silence and harmony I've always dreamed of. With Julia, we turned our weekends into whole adventures. Short trips, gastronomic tours, and exploring local cultural corners became an integral part of a new life. We loved the feeling of freedom, simplicity, and lightness of these days, and as two independent women, we both enjoyed the privacy and tranquility. One day, in a conversation about the future, I suggested to Julia that we join forces and share a cozy house in the village, where we could move together. Julia was hesitant at first, but when I mentioned that we could even arrange regular deliveries of fresh food and run the household together, her face lit up with a smile, and she agreed. Preparations for the move began next week, and in the process of collecting my things, I felt a long-forgotten feeling, the anticipation of a new life, bright and full of hope. We found a magnificent house in the countryside, surrounded by greenery and located so that the view from every window opened onto endless meadows and forests. It was spacious and, most importantly, breathed peace, so unlike the hustle and anxiety that once surrounded me in urban life. The house became our joint refuge, where we could not only relax, but also create. A spacious kitchen, a bright living room, and cozy bedrooms have become the basis for a new chapter in our lives. We were happy to equip our new home, putting into it all the warmth and dreams that we carried with us. Every corner reflected our friendship and common interests, from the bookshelves to the kitchen, where we began to try new recipes and arrange small culinary experiments. We explored the local markets daily, brought home fresh vegetables and fruits, fragrant herbs and spices, and eventually even set up a small vegetable garden where we lovingly grew herbs and several types of vegetables. Our life has become simple, but full of meaning. The days were filled with laughter, friendly conversations, dinners together, and leisurely evenings when we could sit on the veranda enjoying the warm evening air. We shared not only our home, but also our dreams and plans for the future, building together the foundations that would allow us to live happily and confidently. It seemed that together with Julia, we had found a new kind of family based on respect, care, and true friendship. One sunny day, when we had a picnic in our garden, I thought about the path I had traveled. Remembering the years I spent in the shadow of a toxic relationship, I suddenly realized that with every difficulty and trial I gained inner strength and resilience that I hadn't even suspected before. Life with James was left behind, and now I was surrounded by the care and support of a real friend who was there not for convenience, but for the sake of real affection and mutual understanding. Sitting on the soft grass under a clear sky, I reflected on how my life had changed. I realized that happiness does not come from external circumstances, but from within, and that surrounding yourself with people who really support you is priceless. Julia was not just a friend, she became my colleague, with whom I can share joy and find support. Together we have built a world filled with simple joys, self-respect, and a sense of wholeness. Julia and I often immersed ourselves in conversations about the future, allowing ourselves to dream without looking back. We made plans about how one day we would travel to distant countries, taste dishes that we could only hear about before, and maybe even open a small business where we would embody our common passion for cooking and art. The options seemed endless, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely excited about tomorrow. Our new life in the countryside turned out to be not only quiet, but also eventful. Nature seemed to surround us with its warmth, protecting us from all kinds of worries. The fresh air filled with the scent of the forest and flowers, the song of birds at dawn, and the gentle murmur of streams, all this was for me a new source of happiness and inner peace. I learned to appreciate simplicity, which I once thought was boring, and now cherished it as something sacred. Day after day, week after week, time passed unnoticed, taking with it the traces of the past and opening up a bright future for me. Julia and I have become more than just friends to each other. Our lives were intertwined in such a way that every day spent together became a celebration of trust and sincerity. We were there for each other, supporting each other in all the little things, and we always knew that if it suddenly became difficult, there was a person to whom we could entrust our fears and joys. Looking back, I realized that the decision to leave James was my salvation. It allowed me to rediscover myself, break out of the shadows, and build a life in which there is no place for lies and insults, but for light, joy, and genuine communication. Our home became a real refuge, where we were free from condemnation, and everything we felt was mutual and real. We have created a space where you can laugh, talk about your innermost thoughts, and just enjoy every moment. This friendship has taught me invaluable things: self-respect, the importance of my own truth, the joy of living within my own limits, without looking back at past mistakes and resentments. Everything I had been through, all the difficulties and trials, now seemed like a blessing, albeit hidden. With each new day, I became more confident, looking forward with the realization that a happy, sincere, and free life awaits me ahead. Confidence in the future and determination to live this life honestly, in harmony with myself, filled my heart. I was ready to face the future, knowing that with Julia by my side, anything is possible.